For more on this, I want to bring in John Sandweg. He is a former general counsel for the Department of Homeland Security. John, I'm so glad to have you on here to dig in deeper on this, because we just heard former head of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, blame U.S. Capitol Police for intelligence failures. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Secretary Chertoff is exactly right. It doesn't take a rocket scientist at all to predict this. You have a group who has one objective in mind, and that is to stop the certification of Joe Biden as president of the United States. And marching down to the Capitol for that very reason. What's stunning to me is that you had such an absence of force, and you didn't see those layers of security that you need to see when you have this size of group coming with intentions, very clearly stated intention to disrupt the certification of the vote, and this biggest space to cover. The Capitol is obviously a significant area, and it's going to take thousands of officers, but you just never saw that deployment of force that was necessary to deter people from even thinking this was possible, and that's where the failure lies.
Well, you also heard a Democratic leader, Congressman John Clyburn, who told me that he believes that this attack was an inside job. I want to know what you make of that, and also what you think about Capitol Police officers who could be seen taking selfie with rioters. And in some videos, it looks as though there are officers who are not trying to stop that mob from getting in. Could there be a reason why the U.S. Capitol Police may have allowed rioters to breach the halls of Congress?
Well, I certainly hope not. Listen, I think the idea that there was somebody, certainly in the senior leadership ranks of Capitol Police, who intended for this to happen, who were, was an insider, so to speak, I strongly, don't suspect that that's not accurate. Clearly, however, I think what is probably a more plausible explanation here is that there was a dramatic underassessment of the nature of the threat. And I do think you need to look at cultural bias, and I think you need to look at racial bias when you see there's going to be thousands of white protesters coming down, Trump supporters, that somebody dramatically underestimated the nature of the threat. And as Secretary Chertoff pointed out, these people were not being secretive about their intentions. They were placing this on social media. So what happens on the inside is obviously surreal. I think a lot of the officers, once that crowd had broken through, they were more worried about protecting themselves. That doesn't explain people taking selfies. That's frightening, and I hope that needs to be investigated thoroughly by inspector generals. But they'd already lost control at that point. The game was over right there. The failure was in the planning. There needs to be perimeters that are more meaningful than just those aluminum barricades. There needs to be an overwhelming law enforcement presence there to deter these people, to make it clear to them that there is no chance of success, so that there is not breakthrough one layer of security and you have a clear path to the doors of the Capitol. There needs to be multiple layers like you would normally see at the State of the Union, for instance, or you would normally see at an inauguration. Both big events where the Capitol Police play obviously a very significant role in protecting the Capitol. So look, whether I would be stunned if there was an insider who wanted to allow these hooligans to get into the Capitol. But again, that doesn't mean that there aren't some sinister forces at play that resulted in the reasons why, despite the known fact that thousands of people were coming down to the Capitol with the stated intention of stopping the certification of Joe Biden, there was such a paltry law enforcement presence outside the Capitol grounds that really, frankly, made it so easy for this group to just mass up and break through those barriers and up and into the Capitol itself.
Well, you mentioned Black Lives Matter and racial bias, and the assault has certainly magnified the racial equity problems with policing in America. How do you think Black Lives Matter protesters would have been treated in comparison to these pro-Trump supporters who actually did, in fact, storm the Capitol? Yeah,
I think you need to look no further than Lafayette Square. I mean, we have an example of exactly, I think, what we could anticipate the federal response would be, which is, many more officers on site, all wearing tactical gear, layers of security, and quite frankly, a very aggressive physical response. Exactly what we saw, when President Trump went out to the church that day, where tear gas was being used, flashbangs were being used, officers with riot shields were pushing people back. An incredibly aggressive response. That's exactly what you would have seen. But again, if you juxtapose the images of what the federal law enforcement or the law enforcement presence was outside of Lafayette Square this summer during the BLM protests and what was outside of the Capitol, I mean, look, I don't know the specific numbers of exactly how many officers, but I don't think it's a surprise would be surprising to see that there were 2 to 3 times as many officers outside of the White House specifically to prevent anything similar to this happening, based on some sort of belief. Despite, you heard the Metro PD saying, and during I think the tape we were looking at before, that there was no specific intelligence of any intent to breach the Capitol. I don't think there was any specific intelligence of an intent to breach the White House. Nevertheless, you saw that more layered, aggressive approach to law enforcement. Had this been a BLM protest, I guarantee you would have seen the exact same thing with 5 times as many officers, all wearing tactical gear, and any incursion into a kind of a neutral zone outside of the Capitol would have been met forcefully. But clearly we didn't see that here, and we saw the result.
Right. John, do you think that Capitol Police had the appropriate resources for a situation like this? Much has also been made of the National Guard and the timeline for them actually coming in and those requests not being answered, those pleas for help.
Well, clearly, look, the failure the delays in deploying the National Guard, I certainly think need to be dug into deeper. I don't think there's a credible explanation for any delay once the Capitol has been breached. What's interesting to me, though, is that I think there are some additional questions that probably need to be asked of my former agency, Homeland Security, and that is whether or not there was ever any consideration of designating this event a National Special Security Event, or what we call an NSSE. Now, the Capitol Police successfully have managed multiple high-profile events. And I think that's part of what's a frustration here for a lot of people, is that they've done an excellent job of keeping things like this from happening and keeping the Capitol safe during State of the Union addresses, where you have a joint session of Congress and the president and the vice president and the Supreme Court in the building, or inaugurations every 4 years. Obviously, the inaugurations have gone on successfully. Those events are different, though, in that DHS designates them an NSSC. And what that does is it triggers a planning process where you get the entire interagency here. Now, although this wasn't designated an NSSC, the bottom line is the Capitol Police work very, very closely with the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., very, very closely with the U.S. Secret Service, very, very closely with the Park Police. There really is no excuse for the Capitol Police failure to call those agencies in advance and have a multi-agency deployed force like you would have seen. Those agencies have agreements with Capitol PD. They will respond. It's very much the law enforcement culture. And we saw they responded very quickly when they were called upon. But again, look, the failure here,
John,
all in the... Yeah.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but I really want to ask because it seems like, as we've been discussing much of this, sometimes it's lost that there were actually bombs that were placed in the Capitol. There are threats that this will continue throughout the remaining days and up until Inauguration Day. Do you think that inauguration will be safe?
I do. Again, this will be a different process. The U.S. Secret Service will be in charge of the planning process. This will be an NSSC designated event. You'll have a very coordinated interagency response, and they're going to take into account everything we saw on January 6th will be taken into account in the plan for the inauguration. I have no concerns about the inauguration, and I know that those plans are being adjusted based on what happened.
John Sandweg, thank you.
Thank you.